Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. I am Aimee Yeager, the Conference Director of Communications, and I am so excited to introduce to you this week's guest, someone that you are all familiar with, and I know that you will find this conversation both helpful and hopeful. Today, we get the chance to hear from Bishop Ken Carter. Bishop Carter is the resident bishop here in the Western North Carolina Conference, and he has been serving only our conference since January of this year. Prior to that, he served as the bishop in the Florida Conference for 10 years, and in 2022 served both the Florida Conference and the Western North Carolina Conference. Bishop Carter was the president of the Council of Bishops for the United Methodist Church from 2018 to 2020, and he was one of 3 moderators of the Commission on a Way Forward from 2016 to 2018. So he is uniquely poised to speak with us today about the United Methodist Church, the Western North Carolina Conference, and where we are situated in the larger picture of what is going on with our denomination. In this conversation, we get a chance to talk about some of the challenges that Bishop Carter has seen here in the Western North Carolina Conference. But more importantly, what are the opportunities that we have for ministry, for innovative ways to do church? Where can we thrive, and where can we be the best bringers of the kingdom that we can be? Bishop Carter says his great hope for the church is that she will rediscover an orthodox Christian faith that offers the radically inclusive grace of God to all people, and at the same time calls every follower of Jesus to inner holiness, missional compassion, justice rooted in the gospel, and a hopeful story of transformation. I think you will hear that great hope for the church in this conversation. All right, Bishop Carter, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Means of Grace podcast. We're delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Aimee.
So today we just wanted to take some of your time to talk about the opportunities and some of the challenges that we're facing as a conference. This conversation got sparked during your journey through the districts. And while we were in the URE district, one of our young clergy asked you, what are the greatest challenges and opportunities you see? And as y'all had that conversation, I felt that this was a conversation that the conference needed to hear on a larger platform, that more people really needed to hear this. And as we'll get into when we talk about some of the challenges, but we're experiencing a lot of burnout. We're in a time where it's really easy to focus on some of the more negative aspects of what's happening in our denomination, some of the painful aspects and the grief. But there is still opportunities for hope and ministry. So thank you for taking this time to share that with us. I guess I will just go ahead and start. We know that there are challenges in our denomination and in our conference right now, but how would you describe some of those? What are some of the challenges you see?
Well, thank you, Aimee, and thank you for this conversation, those of you who are listening. As I thought about the question of challenges, I remembered someone in the ancient church made a distinction between the church as a school for saints or a hospital for sinners. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's a challenging time to be the church. And it's not unlike the challenge a person faces who works daily in a hospital, where they encounter sick, broken, diseased, overwhelmed, fearful people.
Yeah.
And so it's natural that our churches take on this character because we live in this world, we live in these communities, and people have been through a pandemic. They've been through the polarization of political elections. They've been through personal losses and griefs, and many of them are experiencing conversations around disaffiliation in their churches.
Right.
And so this does lead to this being a challenging time. It's a challenging time for a spiritual leader, whether that's a clergy or whether that's a layperson who has a leadership role in the church. And so it's just the season we're living in. I've said to a number of groups I've been a part of, we don't get to choose the season we live and serve in and lead in. This happens to be ours. And so it's really how we lean toward each other and see the best in each other, and how we trust in God, and how we try to take small and courageous steps.
We don't want to stay too long on the challenges, but we, do want to acknowledge that the challenges are there. And so, like you said, some of our spiritual leaders are exhausted. We are asking people to give a lot more, and we have throughout the pandemic asked our clergy persons and our laity to continue to give in a time when they felt stretched beyond their capacities at some times. And so as we're coming out of that, how are some ways that you see that we can revitalize ourselves, recover from that time of overstretch? What are some opportunities there for renewal?
I think partly it is to try to help our churches be more vital. And I think the conference has done wonderful resourcing in the both and the technology. I saw one church where they had on a big newsprint piece, 179 worshipers last week online. We used to have these little number boards in churches of how many people in worship Sunday school.
Yeah.
But we don't often count the people who worship with us through technology. We almost see them as less than. And that to me lifts people's spirits and morale to know we're actually reaching more people than we may have a few years ago. We just don't see them sitting in a pew next to us. So trying to renew local churches to have healthier practices of leadership, I think, is a part of that. And I would even say the conversations and learnings about racism are also about renewal. They're not for that purpose, but we cannot be a healthy church if we exhibit signs of racism in our practices and our teaching, or if we avoid racism. And I want to encourage listeners, if you've not done the training, laity and clergy, the RISE anti-racism training, which is in every district. We tried to make it accessible to people. And that's one of the important ways the conference has leaned into that conversation. I think that's moving from the challenge to the opportunity. What I've noted is that people will say both, I have less to give to my local church, but I need more from my local church. I have less to give to the annual conference, but I need more. And that's the tension leaders live in.
Right.
It is how to meet the needs of people, how to draw forth their strengths and be patient with them, and acknowledge that there are seasons to work and seasons to rest. And, those are practices like the Sabbath, which are really essential. And so I think that's, for me, some of that journey of moving from the challenges toward the opportunities. My friend Tom Bickerton, the Bishop of New York, called this a pivot in his talk to the Council of Bishops, that at some point we do need to pivot toward the next church and pivot away from the past, pivot toward the future.
That makes me think of the idea of, I think it was Phyllis Tribble who said every 500 years, there's like a revolution of the church, and that maybe this is our time, that this is where we find ourselves. And I've heard you mention to several of our leaders throughout this journey through these districts, the idea of it may not be the time that we want to serve in, but it is the time that we are serving in, and that God will equip us for such a time as this.
An insight that came to me once in the last years was, as I drove by a Confederate flag on I-40 was if I ever wondered how I would have served in the civil rights era in the 60s. And when I came into the ministry, a lot of people, I was ordained in this conference in 1983. So a lot of the people who were serving had served during the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
My friend Bob Tuttle, who was an evangelism professor, had a cross burned in his yard in Anson County. And this is not just any one particular county, but so he knows what it was like to serve during that period. And part of the challenge is we are trying to connect the gospel with injustices we have ignored and become comfortable living with. And this is discipleship. This is sanctification. And as I try to say, it's not being an advocate for one's favorite, cable news program. It's trying to apply the Sermon on the Mount to what we see in our daily life. And whether that is empathizing with an African-American person who rides down a major road in our conference and sees this symbol and what it meant to their ancestors, just trying to empathize with that person, or trying to empathize with a person who is a member of the LGBTQ community and reads our book of discipline and is virtually the only kind of person who is singled out for discrimination. And it's interesting. The book of discipline talks about two groups of people and incompatibility. And one are members of the LGBTQ community, incompatible with Christian teaching. The other sentence, just a few paragraphs later in the discipline, is that it says war is incompatible with Christian teaching. But there's a very nuanced paragraph around that where it talks about our members both serve in the military and have been conscientious objectors. So we have a way to look at a topic and say, and yet we participate in this in different ways. In my own family, my grandfather was a conscientious objector during World War II. He was a Quaker, and I have his card. I have had two nephews who have served in the military. Seen combat. I have been in a church here in this conference in Charlotte where I served communion to a man and his wife and his parents as he was going off to Iraq. A Sunday school class raised money for body armor for another young person in the military. And so we can have these conversations and do this work together. We've learned how to do that. And so that's a complex season again where we find ourselves.
Right. Where so often we want to divide ourselves up into right, wrong. And, sometimes Jesus calls us into that gray area to really see the people and the complexities of their lives.
Right. And I think for us, that's all about how sometimes a person will say to me, well, isn't the scripture clear? Isn't it simple in the scripture? And in a conversation we go on to have, I'll say, we read scripture in light of being a part of a tradition and our reason and our experience. And our experience definitely is the lens through which we read scripture. If a person close to us dies, we read the passages about resurrection much differently and life after death. That's just one of the ways. And one of the ways we move beyond our racism is relationships across ethnicity. One of the ways we move beyond our exclusion of LGBTQ persons is someone in our family comes out.
Right.
And we want to hold on to our faith and our love for this person. That's simply reading scripture in light of tradition, reason, experience. And it's really who we are as United Methodists and Wesleyans. And that's just a practice we've really neglected and need to claim and come back to.
Yeah. It's such a blessing to have that ability to incorporate all aspects of our humanity into our understanding of the divine and into our understanding of what it means to be followers of Jesus. So We touched a little bit on the Rise Anti-Racism training and the challenges that we are facing with these systemic forms of oppression that our brothers and sisters of color and our persons of Indigenous heritage are experiencing. And one of the opportunities that we have coming up, I know in May for some of our youth in the conference, is to take a pilgrimage to Greensboro to the Civil Rights Museum. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what that might mean or what our hopes are for the youth with that experience?
Absolutely. We're going to have on May 20th, which is a Saturday in the morning, a gathering of youth groups from across our conference, and we hope those listening will spread this word. So if your church has one youth or two youth, maybe you could bring that young person. We're going to have a worship service. A lot of that service is going to be the voices of youth and how they understand being a disciple of Jesus and overcoming racism, why those are both important. There's going to be fellowship and community. They get to meet each other. And then we are going to tour the International Civil Rights Museum. I served in Greensboro for 9 years, and I love Greensboro. I have been to the museum and know the history, know some of the people who were present in the sit-ins, some of the persons who sat in the chairs. And to me, this is what I call appreciative inquiry. It is like a gift that's in our own backyard. And a lot of people have not seen this museum or don't know the stories. And I'm really excited about this. And this is a way we learn and train each other and equip. And I'm just really excited about it. It's being planned by Bill White and Bev Copley and Shannon Lemaster Smith. But it's for the youth of our conference to come together.
Wonderful. And I'll just want to let our listeners know, too, that we will put a link in the show notes, both for the Rise Anti-Racism training and for how you can learn more about that pilgrimage in May. So I wrote down a quote that you said to some of the young clergy in the URE district, helping us to make that pivot from challenges to opportunities. But you told them we do have the need for deconstructing things and for criticizing things and naming some of these systems that we need to tackle and maybe tear down or maybe just, reinvent, look at in new, fresh ways. Also, in addition to deconstructing, we have to start building and we have to start constructing things. And you mentioned two things that we could start building. We could start building up disciples and we could start building up our parishioners' prayer lives. What does that mean to you?
Well, and first let me say I'm a white male of a certain age, and all of that is privilege. And deconstruction is my being aware of the privilege that surround my life and how they create imbalance and inequity. And so that is absolutely ongoing. I was thinking about the seminary experiences for some people, just in the way we read scripture. We read scripture, we go into seminary, and it's like taking a car apart and putting every piece of the engine in the yard. And it just lays there. And maybe the car doesn't function the way it once did. And so the other side of deconstruction is if we deconstruct everything, and there was a petition at the 2019 General Conference to dissolve the United Methodist Church. And it was a petition by a person who's now the leader of the Global Methodist Church, who is a friend, I would say. We've spent a lot of time together. But if the United Methodist Church is dissolved, Aimee, everything we've talked about goes to zero.
Yeah.
And that does disproportionate harm to a lot of people.
Right.
In terms of their equitable compensation of salary, in terms of grants for underrepresented communities, in terms of the ways we have invested in church buildings, the way the Duke Endowment has invested in rural churches and camps. I could go on.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with one of our campus ministers. They are increasingly serving college students who don't have enough to eat and don't have a place to sleep in their cars, and just increasingly serving college students who don't have those financial resources. That's the work of one of our Wesley foundations.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by constructing. And so I would just say, for us, being a disciple is following Jesus to the places where he already is and meeting the people he is already a part of their lives. And that's the mission. It's in our communities, and it's where our churches are really making a difference. And you and I have seen some of these places in Asheboro and Albemarle.
Yeah. I was just thinking of the work of Wesley CDC working to help churches that have closed. And this, I think it was in Asheboro that we saw working with First Asheboro to turn a closed church building into a shelter for women. Right.
Lydia's place, the only shelter for women in Randolph County.
Yeah.
And so I told the board who were there, I said, this is who we are. This is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we met some of the persons who lived there. We clearly said we don't need to see them if we wanted to honor their privacy and dignity, but they wanted to see us. Yeah. And so, that's the disciple making. And then I think the equipping people to pray. And again, many people have been through a lot, who come to our churches, who serve in our churches, who contribute to our churches, and just sustaining them in their spiritual lives is really core. And so I do think that's a big part of it. I think also on a larger scale in our conference, it's the pivot that the May 6th called session of the annual conference is about. That we know we have churches who have told us they do not want to be United Methodist churches. Yeah. And they've clearly signaled that, and we've had a process for them to discern that and vote on that. And this is not a large number of churches. In some of the churches, it's an overwhelming number who want to depart. Most of the churches where there's a vote, the vote is far less than 50 people voting. And then some of the churches, 2 of the churches, I met their pastors last week, the vote was by 1 vote. And so we want to shorten the time between those votes and when these churches can get on with their life of church in a new way.
Right.
They said they don't want to be United Methodist. And so they can be independent. They can be Baptist. They can be another form of Methodist. And as I said, in the family tree of churches, we all have a place. And that will happen on May 6th. The conference will vote. So those churches can depart, which means they won't need to come to annual conference. They really won't be a part of our conferencing. They've said we want to be separate from that. They've initiated this. And also some of the clergy who serve them are also ready to not be in the United Methodist Church. And this is also a gracious way of honoring their decision, sending them forth. I'll offer a prayer blessing and that morning for both in those 2 online meetings. And then after May 6th, whether that's 50 churches or 80 churches or 100 churches, that's our thinking about the churches we're a part of, which is a minority of our churches.
Yeah,
every
absolutely.
Church is important. And then, so part of the pivot is they then can be the church that God's calling them to be. And we will begin to plant new communities in these areas with the persons who want to be United Methodist and persons we've not been able to reach. And so that's exciting to me. That's the constructive part. We happen to be living in the midst of all that. Sometimes it's messy. And I did want to say, you asked the question about how we live in this time. I would just appeal, especially to clergy, and I'm preaching to myself too, to try to see the best in each other. And that means for persons who are remaining United Methodists, we don't disparage people who are leaving. We try to send them forth with a blessing. We know our paths will continue to cross. We work on personal reconciliation. And I think for persons who are leaving, it is, and we'll soon get to this point, it is to cease speaking in our churches in a disparaging way about the United Methodist Church. And that's just not the way to start an evangelical church. And so I'm appealing to all of us to simply try to see the best in each other. And that might be calling someone up and saying, hey, let's meet for coffee. Yeah. And I'll meet you halfway. Yeah. And I've had meals and meetings in the last few weeks with people in all areas of this. My clear calling is to strengthen the United Methodist connection. I believe in it for all the reasons we've talked about. And I'm excited about hopefully our getting through some of this. Although I think, as I've said, I don't believe it's kind of like, let's just hold our breath and get through it and then we can be disciples later. I think Jesus is teaching us about how to be a disciple in this now.
Right.
And there are lessons we'll learn with each other that will carry the rest of our lives.
Well, thank you. I think that's a fantastic way to end this conversation, to remind us that we have a connection as United Methodists with other United Methodists, but that Jesus calls us to also live in connection with people who we may not see eye to eye with. I think about all the people that Jesus sat down with to have meals, and not all of them were his disciples, but he still broke bread with them. So thank you for offering that challenge to us and being here with us today. Is there anything else you would like to say before we?
No, just thank you, Aimee, for the conversation. You've been with us in many of the places where we've seen the church. I would just say that I think I said to you in one place, social media is not reality.
Right.
And to see the real flesh and blood people of the church motivated by their faith to make a difference in their communities, whether people are homeless, whether they are without food, whether they are struggling with an addiction, right, whether they are in a storm, to see systemically how we've done that with children like at Crossnor, children who need a sanctuary of hope and healing, as they say. That's really exciting to me. And one of my wise friends has said, what we feed grows. And I think we need to feed more of the hope and more of the faithfulness and more of the courage. And it's out there. And I think also we need to move toward each other and move away from our isolation if we're feeling that. And I also see that happening. And that's been one of the blessings to me of getting out in the first 4 districts, and the remaining 4 I will be in a little bit later in the winter.
Yeah.
So thank you, Aimee.
Thank you, Bishop Carter. We are so grateful for Bishop Carter's leadership here in the Western North Carolina Conference and for his hopeful vision for the future as we walk through these difficult and sometimes sad and sometimes scary times right now here in our conference and in our denomination. I hope that you found that conversation as inspiring as I did, and I hope that it has reignited a sense of passion for the work of God's church and a love and commitment to the expression of God's church as it is found in the United Methodist Church. And friends, we want to make this podcast a two-way conversation with you. So we are going to ask you to start sending us some emails each week. We have a new email address. It is meansofgrace@wncumc.org. Again, that's meansofgrace@wncumc.org. So that's like Western North Carolina Conference United Methodist Church, wncumc.org. Send us your questions about the episodes or just what your questions are for the church these days. What can our leaders here in the conference answer for you? Who would you like to hear us talk to? What are your thoughts on the state of the church And how would you like us to open up those conversations here on this platform? So be sure to email us. We'll be monitoring that, checking that regularly. What you submit will greatly impact our editorial calendar and the content that comes out here on this podcast. We'll also try to do a Q&A session with Bishop Carter a couple of times a year. So, send in those questions that you would have for Bishop Carter at this time, and, we'll help to direct those shows. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of the United Methodist Church here in Western North Carolina Conference. We are so grateful for you.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.